that we are together probably bring some science into like people's life and help them better understand these topics.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be here, and hopefully, we can help people stay informed.
Yeah, so just for anybody who doesn't know you, can you give a little bit like a short introduction of who you are, what you do, what you enjoy?
Absolutely, yeah. So I am known on Instagram as Vitamin PhD. I think people are probably fairly familiar with or if they're not, some people are familiar with my background in the gut microbiome and human metabolism. So I create quite a bit of content to dispel the myths and misinformation around what's kind of known as gut health, commonly referred to as gut health. And I also speak at about client-centered coaching. I've helped to sort of develop and operationalize a framework called comprehensive coaching. And that is a nutritionally agnostic, client-centered approach to support flourishing health, which looks different on everyone and integrates the skills and practices of motivational interviewing, acceptance and commitment training, and cognitive behavioral coaching. So I help people change from the inside out.
Yeah, and there's like a mouthful description, but also changing people inside out. You know, it's like from the mind perspective and also from the gut perspective. So let's
That's
dive
exactly it.
let's dive into the today's topics. So first, we will start by speaking about gut health and what it actually is. So because like you said, there is a lot of misinformation, like especially in the recent maybe months, years, there has been a lot of
Mhm.
research, but also a lot of interest from the general public on it, probably also due to a lot of marketing. And yeah,
Mhm.
there are a lot of information. So I think it would be nice to introduce people into the topic by speaking about like what is actually a healthy gut.
Absolutely. So this is a term that is used, as you mentioned, in marketing, and it's sort of used colloquially or among kind of like the pop to mean a number of different things, and also sort of nothing because it doesn't have one clear definition. It is not a term really used in the research world, but it's one that I've tried to develop a definition for based on what people are usually talking about when they say gut health. And I've called this the 3 Ds of gut health. So we're talking about diversity of the gut microbiome, the absence or presence of disease in the gastrointestinal tract, and also the subjective ratings of one's digestion. So when we talk about the diversity of the microbiome, we're talking about the variety and proportions of organisms that live in the gut, as well as the genetic material. So we're talking about the taxonomy or who's there, and also the functionality, what they can do. And ideally, we have enough diversity to create a resilient ecosystem, but one that's not so diverse that there's no sort of redundancy. Because if we have something that's too diverse and everyone has one unique function, if we lose just one small group, we lose an entire set of functions. So we wouldn't want that to happen, but we also don't want to have so little diversity that we're not capable of performing a variety of different functions. So that's diversity. Then we can look at the anatomy and physiology of the actual digestive tract in which the microbiome lives. And that's looking more at the human side of things. So the absence of a disease of either the anatomy, so like the tissues of the gut, or the physiology, the function of the gut. And then also we can look at digestion. So these would be subjective ratings of things like bloating, diarrhea, constipation, gas. So people are ideally, they're usually striving for comfortable digestion. So they are breaking down all of the foods that we have the capacity to break down and absorbing them and dealing with really a tolerable amount of gas and comfortable bowel movements.
And I suppose that gut health is not something that is unified, as you mentioned, and that it also can change probably during the life cycle of a person, and that there are also different, maybe external, also internal factors that would change the microbiome, and that is probably why it is hard to define a healthy gut or what would be the ideal gut flora.
Right, that's exactly correct. So, the issue with trying to define one healthy gut is that each individual's microbiome, each person's set of microorganisms and genes, is highly individual. Now, humans share a core microbiome. So, there are some organisms that we would expect to see in all humans, and that's about 1/3 of any individual's microbiome. But the other 2/3 are going to be specific to that individual based on their gender, their age, their location, their physical activity habits, their diet, and the absence or presence of a disease. And we don't have any causative links between the microbiome and any state of health or disease. So that means even though we can sometimes draw a correlation, we notice that there are some patterns in two things occurring at the same time, we don't know whether one thing causes the other. So we don't know whether the disease causes a change in the microbiome or whether a change in the microbiome could cause a disease. And that's where we really run into some challenges when we're trying to make this practical for folks, and where sort of influencers and manufacturers might come in and make some claims that are not supported by the evidence and try to create causality or create a problem so they can then sell a solution.
Yeah, so that could be hard to navigate then for a person who doesn't really research this and maybe is not directly interested into this topic and doesn't go deep into the topic. So I hope that actually you help me today to bring or shed some light into this. And like you said, there are many different factors that affect one's gut, and not everyone's gut is like healthy. And we know, or basically from my research, I know that there can be different gut microflora, for example, in a population that is in Africa, that is in India, that is in the US. And then it's hard to say like, okay, this is the exact what we should strive for. And maybe it is, or some people propose that based off that gut flora, we should ideally consume foods that these certain strains of bacteria helps us digest. So for example, in Africa, you would have a different microbiome, so you would eat probably more starchy vegetables or something like this. And from my perspective, it's like chicken or an egg kind of question, like what comes first? Is it like the gut microbiome and therefore we should eat based on the microbiome, or is it like by the way we eat we develop the microbiome?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's if we could establish a greater likelihood of one or the other, it looks like our diet is what's really influencing which microbes are present. And we can tell that this is the case because we can do interventions, whether it be in rodents or humans, and reproducibly see the same effect of certain interventions. So, for example, if we have a diet that is very high in fat and very low in fiber and microbe accessible carbohydrates, so the ones that are indigestible to us, then we reproducibly see a reduction in overall diversity, mostly because we see a reduction in carbohydrate fermenters and butyrate producers like bifidobacteria. So rather than, but at the same time, we can also think of it in terms of eating to support our microbes. So we wouldn't necessarily look at our microbes and say, okay, this is the, based on your, stool analysis, these are the foods that you should eat or not. Because by and large, what we're going to find is that we are in the large intestine, in the colon, colonized by a lot of obligate anaerobes. So they are microbes that really don't thrive in the presence of oxygen. So they need an oxygen poor environment. And they do a lot of fermentation of carbohydrates. And we don't need a stool analysis to tell us that. We have a lot of empirical data to tell us that. So we have a lot of research showing us both the various sort of micro ecosystems that we have within the gut. So we have micro environments based on the oxygen and the acidity. And that's really is going to influence which microbes are present. And then those microbes are going to use specific sources of energy. And so we would, across the board, find that, most people have plenty of these fermenters in their colon, and so they need to have carbohydrates. That would be pretty much everyone. So it's sort of silly to think that we would need a stool analysis to tell us that, because we're really going to see, the same thing across the board. Now, there may be, of course, like as I mentioned, some individual differences, but that doesn't dictate what we should be eating. Rather, it represents what we have been eating, as well as things like our physical activity level, perhaps any antibiotics we've used recently, and and as I mentioned earlier, age and locale and whatnot. So really, if we're thinking about it in terms of a practical approach, it would be more realistic to say that we should be eating to support the variety of microbes rather than like having our microbes tell us what to eat.
Mm-hmm. And what is actually the variety we should strive for? Maybe not directly from the variety of microbes, because we cannot generally measure that. I mean, unless you get lab results, but maybe from the perspective of food that we eat, how much variety is enough? Because sometimes there are proposed like 30 different kinds of vegetables, or somebody says like 50 different kinds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that 30 different plants per week came from the American Gut Project, which is a really cool sort of citizen science project. It's crowdsourced data. What they do is they invite people to send in their fecal samples as well as questionnaires that record their dietary habits. And they found that people who were eating or reported eating 30 different plants per week had the greatest level of microbial diversity in their fecal samples. Now, that's not to say that 30 is the cap. We might see even more diversity at 50 or 60 plants per week, but that was just an artifact of the question on the survey. So it is a good place to start. And we can also keep in mind that we don't necessarily need 30 different types of vegetables. People often think of plants synonymously with vegetables in the diet, but it's any sort of plant food. So it could be fruits, vegetables, legumes like beans, nuts, tofu. So there are, and then whole grains, starchy vegetables like root vegetables. So there are a number of different avenues to increase our dietary variety. And really what we're trying to achieve there is to provide our microbes with a wide variety of these microbe accessible carbohydrates, because at this time we don't know which microbes actually prefer which type of microbe accessible carbohydrate. Some might like to use resistant starch, others might want to use a galacto-oligosaccharide, and others might want to use something like mannitol. So the key is just that we are sort of providing a whole mix so that they can sort of choose what it is that they want to eat, and we can reduce the potential competition between microbes for those energy sources. Because if we were to only feed one type of fiber or a very low amount of fiber, then there would be certain groups that would thrive at the expense of others. And then we may see, again, that loss in diversity. So it doesn't have to be a vegan or vegetarian diet. We don't see a clear advantage compared to a prudent omnivorous diet, but something resembling the Mediterranean dietary pattern would probably be one sort of practical and widely known way of eating that seems to include a lot of the foods that are currently associated with microbial diversity. So things like vegetables, nuts, polyunsaturated fats, from fish, for example, omega-3 fatty acids, just to name a few, and even, low to moderate red wine intake. That's also been associated with microbial diversity in these large population-based studies where we're sort of looking at people's dietary patterns and then drawing correlations between those and their microbes.
Yeah, so for anybody who is listening, it's not like you should drink now one bottle of wine daily and a lot of fish and that's it.
No.
That's not permission to do that.
Right.
Anyway, you just gave me an idea, because one of the very discussed questions, like specifically vegan diets, is the conversion of ALA to EPA and DHA, and that is done by microbiome, right?
Well, that would be, it's the microbiome does potentially increase overall energy availability and produce small amounts of vitamins and minerals for us. And potentially play a role in enhancing the bioavailability of some of these nutrients. That being said, we don't necessarily have data to illustrate that it would enhance the bioavailability of a plant-based nutrient compared to that of an animal-based nutrient. So that's one of the challenges if we're looking at getting essential fatty acids from plant sources versus animal sources like fatty fish or krill oil, that the bioavailability is significantly lower. We could theorize that potentially people who are eating more of those plant-based sources might be sort of selectively enhancing levels of the microbes that could play a role in those conversions, and potentially enhance the bioavailability of those nutrients. And again, because a vegan diet hasn't been associated with reduced health outcomes, we wouldn't necessarily want to say that that's going to be an inferior way of eating compared to getting essential fatty acids from animal sources. Assuming that they're doing things like considering a slightly higher need of something like protein. But yeah, it's a really interesting area of research to look into how the microbes can enhance the availability of energy and nutrients in the diet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting topic because, like you basically touched the topic, certain microbiomes can increase the also absorption of, let's say, overall energy. And I think this is one of the myths when it comes to caloric intake. Let's say we cannot, as far as I know, specifically tell that, okay, microbiome or healing your gut can improve or help you lose weight because now you, I don't know, extract more energy, so you don't need so many calories or something along these lines. I don't know, maybe you have heard about this?
Well, we have pretty limited data on the actual capacity of energy harvesting in terms of, the number of calories. But I've seen anywhere in the range from up to 200 calories per day in one study, and other estimates include, by percentage, enhancement of 10 to 15% of our calories of our caloric intake. So, if a person was eating a 2,000 calorie a day diet, they could could see, 200, 300 extra calories per day based on those estimates. So it would be, potentially enough to modify our energy balance if we were pursuing weight loss and the weight was coming off more slowly than we anticipated, and we had really accurate ways of tracking our expenditure and our intake. Then we would have to potentially make an adjustment for that and say, okay, maybe I'm, harvesting an additional 200 calories a day that I wasn't accounting for. And so, I would need to reduce my intake or increase my expenditure or both, to sum up to that additional 200 calories. But it would not likely be enough to completely stall weight loss in an appreciable energy deficit. And again, it's something that would have to be, counted as sort of a variable to consider when making those adjustments.
Certainly. So let's take a step back a little bit now. What is actually the advantage or disadvantage of having good gut health when it comes from the standpoint of like general population and specifically athletic population? I mean, getting that diversity of microbes.
You're asking what would be the benefit?
Yeah, I mean, we have, for example, standard American diet or somebody who doesn't eat as many veggies, for example. So they probably don't have as much variety, right? And they might maybe cutting themselves short on some way. It can have probably some health effects.
Yeah, that's certainly a potential. So at the extremes, we could look at the example of a person who is taking really strong antibiotics. They have an increased risk of developing what's called a C. difficile infection. So C. diff is actually a normal inhabitant of the GI tract, but when we experience a significant loss of diversity, that potential pathogen then becomes an actual pathogen. It starts to produce the factors that can actually cause illness. So if we take that into consideration, then we have evidence that the diversity and the relative proportions of microbes really does play a role in sort of maintaining homeostasis. We could look at it in that way. So if we take a less extreme example and look at folks who might be consuming a diet that is really low in fiber or completely devoid of fiber, that we do also have evidence to illustrate, again, a loss of diversity, especially a loss of those fermenters that are producing some beneficial short-chain fatty acids like butyrate. Now, that may not lead to, a C. diff infection, but it certainly could modify our potential to fight off other pathogens that we might ingest or that might reside in the gut. And we've also started to see some data in athletes that inadequate fiber intake is associated with lower than expected diversity. So in folks who are physically active, we tend to see higher diversity compared to people who are sedentary, but that's not the case when those active people are eating inadequate fiber. So when they're getting, maybe only 10 or 15 grams of fiber per day, that their microbial diversity is no different from a sedentary person. And we can see that there are negative correlations between fat intake and protein intake and microbial diversity or bifidobacteria when fiber intake is inadequate as well. So it looks like fiber could potentially mediate the relationship between exercise and microbial diversity. So we may not be fully realizing the beneficial effects of exercise on the microbiome either. So those are just a couple of the main examples of potential problems that could come out of an inadequate amount of microbe accessible carbohydrate. And there are theories too that especially in westernized countries like in the US, where we've been eating lower amounts of fiber and a more refined diet, that there's been sort of a generational progressive loss of microbial diversity and also the functional diversity. So the number of different genes that we have compared to those, agrarian societies that are still consuming upwards of, 100 or 125 grams of fiber per day. So that's another theory that there could be, a trajectory toward lower and lower diversity and lower functional capacity with really unknown health outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And so, are there any benefits, for example, for athletes to supplement with probiotics or maybe prebiotics?
That's an interest, right? That's an interesting area. There are now in terms of supplementing with prebiotics, so that would be sort of the energy source for the microbes. There's really no need for that because we ingest prebiotics with all sorts of plant foods. So we really don't need to, to spend the money on getting a supplement because we could eat, fruits and vegetables and whole grains and serve the same function.
Right.
When we're looking at the
sorry for interruption. Is there maybe some evidence that prebiotics in a supplemental form, are they as effective as the food?
Well, in some cases, yes. So it depends on also kind of what we're thinking about as effective. So when we're looking at outcomes like appetite regulation, blood sugar regulation, yes, we've seen that in individuals with overweight or obesity, supplementing with something like inulin could potentially modify appetite. Now, that doesn't necessarily lead to changes in weight, in terms of like weight modification outcomes. And it's also associated with gastrointestinal distress. So we want to be prudent in, our use of prebiotic supplements, because especially when we're looking at an athletic population that may already be predisposed to GI distress because they're engaging in intense endurance exercise, that supplementing with a highly fermentable source of fiber would be certainly excellent substrate for the microbes, but would probably also lead to a great deal of gas production, which would be problematic. And, if we're also looking at things like, cost effectiveness, if we can get a wider variety of fiber types with spending the same amount of money as what we would spend on something like a prebiotic supplement, which is generally going to be one source of microbe accessible carbohydrate, one source of fiber or fermentable carbohydrate, it's probably better for us to buy a wider variety rather than feeding just one substrate to the microbes, because we don't know, who is going to need what for energy. So I would say, in terms of practical effectiveness, then it still would be, attaining that from foods would still be superior. When we're looking at the effects of probiotics in athletes, we really do not see an effect on athletic performance. So there's no justification for using a probiotic to enhance strength, capacity, for force production, endurance exercise. We just either the data hasn't been collected yet, or, as is the case with a lot of competitive sport, like team sports and endurance athletes, probiotic supplementation just really doesn't pan out. That being said, there is emerging evidence that the use of fermented dairy, which is considered a probiotic food, that may modulate the immune system and reduce the severity of upper respiratory tract infections. And that could be helpful for an athlete, in terms of reduced number of sick days. And there are, emerging microbes now that are being found in elite athletes in higher levels than what's found in, recreational exercisers or sedentary individuals. So it could be that we, may not have identified a helpful probiotic strain yet. It's the ones that we've looked at haven't been supportive, but that doesn't rule out the future of, probiotic supplementation to support athletic performance. We do have some rodent data, but again, rodent data doesn't always extrapolate to humans. In fact, it quite often doesn't when we're looking at interventions.
Yeah, right. So now speaking again about or context of this athletic population. Now, what is actually the impact of maybe practices that these athletes take and on the gut health? For example, I mean specifically like restricted energy intake, for example. So I know from practice that, for example, after hard training, you have this window basically when you are more prone to getting disease, and your immune system is downregulated, right? So there's one possibility, or that, for example, food, some allergen, maybe peanuts, can get introduced into your digestive tract, and it can cause maybe some harm, or you can develop some kind of food intolerance. And then, the restricted energy intake, like overall, which is specific to maybe female track athletes or endurance athletes, figure athletes.
Yeah, that one's a difficult one because the effects of energy restriction vary. We don't have a great deal of data looking at energy restriction. We don't have any data looking at energy restriction in an athletic population and that effect, the effects that would have on their microbiota. We have some data looking at the effects of energy restriction in individuals with overweight or obesity. And it's quite variable. In some cases, there's no change to microbial diversity. In other cases, there's an elevation in diversity, but it's unclear whether that is due to the energy restriction or to the change in weight, or potentially, change in dietary habits, as the ratio of carbohydrates to proteins changes.
Right. Let me reframe the question. Maybe not directly in correlation or energy restriction to microbiota, but to gut health, basically, because also in a energy restricted state, also your gut lining can get damaged, maybe, and we see that also people can develop these different intolerances in that state.
In rodents, there is some evidence that not necessarily energy restriction, but a reduction in fiber intake, for example, during a ketogenic diet, that is associated with reduced thickness of the protective mucus layer in the large intestine. Extreme endurance exercise is associated with elevated or altered intestinal permeability. So there's certainly a potential for substances to sort of leak between the intestinal cells. And we don't really have data looking at resistance training. That's actually something that I'm involved in at the moment, a collaboration with Lipscomb University to look at the effects of an intense resistance training bout on intestinal permeability. And allergies can certainly form, can certainly develop later in life. So that could be one potential mechanism, associated with intestinal permeability. I would be very hesitant to say anything that would be, confirmatory of that, just given that it would be, it's just a mechanism. It's a potential mechanism that we have. It also probably depends on the severity and the duration of energy restriction. and that interacting with a person's habitual diet up to that point, and the microbial diversity really early in life as well is associated with the development of allergies. Now, something like a food intolerance, that is actually due to the production or the lack of production of digestive enzymes, which would be independent of the microbiome. Those can also develop later in life, most commonly lactose intolerance. But there are some foods, food compounds for which we don't have a digestive enzyme. So when we're looking at things like galactic oligosaccharides, which are found in beans, mannitol, which is found in cauliflower, sorbitol found in avocados. So a lot of sort of the classic, whole foods, sort of like bodybuilding style diet. Those are just really high in fermentable carbohydrates. We don't and have not ever produced those digestive enzymes. And so they are universally not tolerated by humans. And that's why they're such excellent energy sources for the microbes. But, theoretically, as a person is engaging in an energy restricted diet, they're usually really increasing their veggie intake. That coupled with the reduction in gastric motility could lead to bloating, gas, constipation, and general GI distress. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they've had an elevation in intestinal permeability. Altered intestinal permeability is actually not correlated with GI distress. There's really no way for us to tell that we have a more permeable gut outside of doing specific assays. So hopefully that kind of sheds some light on things that, the intolerances are different from allergies, because allergies are actually immune mediated and could happen again via, the route of altered intestinal permeability. But sometimes they happen via unknown means, it's unclear why people sometimes will develop allergies later in life.
Right. So to wrap it up, both allergies and intolerances can be developed throughout the life cycle, and probably in extreme endurance sports due to this lowered, let's say, immune response, there is a potential that you can develop some, I would call it, transient intolerance to food.
Well, it would really be more of an elevated immune response. It would be sort of an overreaction of the immune system rather than immunosuppression. But if you're looking at, the potential, if we're looking at the intestinal wall as part of immune defense, then we could classify, an enhanced intestinal permeability and the reduction in the protective mucus as sort of a fault in our immune defenses.
Mm-hmm. Right. And by the way, is even food intolerance something that would be like classified as or defined or well defined?
Well, yeah. So food intolerances are, if we're looking at like a lactose intolerance, or we're looking at sort of like we could look at like fructose malabsorption. So we don't have a digestive enzyme for fructose. We just have transport. We have protein channels for fructose to enter our intestinal cells. But because it relies on a difference in concentration outside and inside of the cell, if there's a lot of fructose already inside of the intestinal cell, then the fructose that is still hanging out in the actual digestive tract in the lumen will just be kind of stuck there, and it pulls or attracts water, and so that can create loose stool, and then it can also lead to gas production as it's metabolized by the microbes. So intolerances are well defined and allergies are well defined. The term that people use a lot that is sort of a marketing term would be food sensitivities. So that's where they're usually referring to an IgG antibody response to a food. And the IgG antibody is simply a recognition antibody. So if you go get a food sensitivity test and see that you have high IgG antibodies to certain foods, it's just because you've eaten those foods before and your immune system recognizes them. It's not an indication that you are having, some sort of reaction, some sort of negative reaction to those foods.
Yeah, and fun fact, that's how I actually went vegan, because I got food intolerance test, and it's shown IgGs to eggs, to wheat gluten, to milk or dairy, basically, and to something else.
Oh,
So that was start of my vegan journey.
oh my goodness. So it sounds like so those must have been foods that you were eating up to that point, and so your immune system recognized them. And that happens to a lot of people, and then they end up, sort of feeling at a loss sometimes with quite restrictive diets.
Yeah, definitely. And it was like, for example, for eggs, it was like kind of surprise to me, because I haven't ever been like a big egg eater. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the other, okay, that made sense. But anyway, later in life, I found out basically what you just summarized, that these IgGs are not a reliable source of
Right.
information, or to make this decision that I should avoid these kind of foods.
Yeah, I'm glad that you made that discovery and were able to expand your diet back out.
Yeah, I think it was actually you speaking in some of the podcasts that I came across, and that's what got me the information that I needed. Anyway, to wrap up,
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
yeah, to wrap up this topic. So, what is the basic recommendation for people now? To give like maybe in 3 sentences or less, just how to take care of their
Hmm.
gut health.
Absolutely, yeah. It would be to eat a variety of plant foods, ideally at each meal, if possible, and to engage in regular physical activity, trying to at least meet, general recommendations of, 30 minutes or so per day, and to bias the diet more toward a higher carbohydrate intake rather than a higher fat intake. Those seem to be three of the main drivers of microbial diversity.
Thank you very much. And let us or tell them, where can they find you, how can they get in touch with you, and what can they find more about on your media.
Yeah, absolutely. So they can find me on Instagram at Vitamin PhD. I have two websites, vitaminphdnutrition.com, if they want to learn about coaching, mentoring, and gut health opportunities. And then also btgcomprehensivecoaching.com. That's where I run the all of the content with my colleague Shannon Beer, and we speak about our comprehensive coaching framework there.
Awesome. So thank you once again for finding the time and sharing all your knowledge and expertise, and hope to see you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and before you leave, it would be awesome if you could leave a rating and a review on the platform or an application that you use for listening. It will help me greatly to bring new guests and discuss topics you are interested in. By the way, check the show notes for important links, maybe that we discussed during the episode and all the other, and subscribe to Health, Energy, and Performance newsletter, where I share at least one tip about nutrition, training, and mindset that will help you reach your health and fitness goals easily. I would also like to invite you to have a strategy call with me. During this 30 minutes call, we will first dive into your goals. I will get to know you, your lifestyle, and you will get a clear direction and know exactly what to do next to progress your training and maybe improve your eating habits. I started this as a personal challenge for my 30th birthday, and I fell in love with it. I really loved connecting with people and helping them solve their issues and problems during these strategic calls, so naturally I continue doing so. Mind you, this is not a sales call, but you must be ready to invest your energy and time to get the benefit. So check the show notes, sign up for the call, and I will be looking forward to hear from you.